Okay, so in this video, we're going to discuss something about scope in Java specifically. Okay, so we talked about object-oriented programming. We talked about the 4 core pillars of object-oriented programming, and we also had a little bit of an introduction to object-oriented programming. However, we're going to take a little break from that. We're going to talk about scope, and scope is actually really useful to know before we move on to things like constructors. You've already been familiar with scope if you know methods. You'll probably understand it a little better when I discuss about it, but this video is about scope, so let's go ahead and get started. So you've already learned part of scope, and that part of scope is modifiers. If you haven't checked out my modifiers video, be sure to go check that out. It's pretty long and tedious, but it does have a lot of good information that you need to know. You just have to know what all the access modifiers are and all the behavioral modifiers are. Behavioral and non-access are just synonyms, so they mean the same thing. Okay, so let's talk about scope. The definition of scope. The region in which a variable can be accessed. By the way, this does align with Unit 5.8 of the APCSA curriculum. Lesson 5.8 talks about scope and access, so a little bit about modifiers, which is what I talked about previously, and then scope, which is what we're going through now. So yeah, it does align with that. So for those of you taking the AP exam, pay attention. Okay, so scope is the region in which a variable can be accessed. Simple definition in itself. The region in which a variable can be accessed. There are 3 types. You have class level scope, you have method level scope, and then you have block level scope. This is also known as loop level scope. So like when you declare a variable in a for loop, so like for int I equals 0, that integer I is only available in that for loop. If you assign I to something else or you do something with that I variable outside the for loop, your compiler is going to give you an error because it can't access the I variable outside the for loop. And that's all really what scope is. So hopefully through the words, you can kind of understand what each of these things do. So class level scope. Variable is accessible among the entire class. So this means that in my class, I've made an integer, let's say I made an integer I, and I made it equal to 0 in my class. That means the entire, I can initialize or I can do whatever I want with I inside that class only. And this is one of the most broadest scopes out there. You can also make it with an access modifier like private and stuff like that, but that's different. Private just means that it's only accessible within that class. That's why we make our class variables private all the time, because we don't want other classes to mess up with them. And we talked about this in encapsulation. Whenever we make it private, we have to make getters and setters in order to access them with in other classes. So that's class level scope. Method level scope, same thing. You should probably be able to interpret the definition by now. Only in the method. A catch to method level scope is that the parameters you pass into a method, so like you have your method signature, and then you have your parameters, like let's say int x, int y. Those parameters are only available inside the method. You can't use them in anywhere else. You can only use them in that method. This also includes when you define a variable inside a method. So let's say you make an integer j equals 4. You can only use that j inside that method because that's where you declared it in. So you can't use it outside the class, you can't use it in a loop or anything else like that. And then block level scope, variable is available only in the loop. But it's really just block in general. Loop, block, people call them synonyms, but loop level scope isn't really specific because it's not only accessible in just loop, it's accessible in the block. By block, I just mean the body after the curly brace. So this is like your method signature, or whatever, your if statement or whatever. This is your block. And that's why I call it block level scope. Because this can't be just a for loop, right? Whatever's in here, it can be a for loop, it could be a while loop, it could be an if statement, it could be an else statement, it could be an else if statement, it could be anything, which is why we call it block level scope. Because whenever we declare it inside that block, it's only available inside that block. Like outside it, you can't really do it. Otherwise, your compiler is going to throw you an error. So those are the three types of scopes. So I should really change the definition. Variables only available in the block. And by the block, I mean in between the curly braces. So like that. And that really is scope. So let's go ahead and demonstrate it with examples. Hopefully that should make sense. First thing I want to demonstrate is class level scope. Hopefully I have room to write this, otherwise I'm going to have to erase the definition of scope. So first we're going to discuss about class level scope. Stretch that class all the way down. So let's say we have a private integer equals 2. This means that I can access this anywhere inside this class. However, just the key thing I forgot to say is that I can't use this j before I declare it. So if I go in a previous line and I say j equals 1, I can't use j because j isn't defined yet, and your compiler is just going to throw you an error. So that's why you can only utilize j after you've defined it in that line. So all these lines can use j, but these lines above cannot use j. So I'm going to move this. And I'm going to make a private integer called j, and I'm going to make it equal to 2. So this right here cannot initialize j. So in your program, the lines above, so let's say this is line 1 and line 2. So let's say line 1 cannot initialize Hopefully that makes sense why. Because j isn't defined yet. You have to define something before you can actually use it. So you can't just use it without defining it. So that's why line 1 can't use j variable. But all these lines, however, can use it. So line 3 onward can use j variable. That's a very important thing to throw out with scope, because people are going to be like, I already have j initialized, why can't I use it in previous lines? You can't, because you can only use your j variable or your any variable after you've defined it. You can't use it before it. So hopefully that makes sense. Lines 3 onward can use the j variable, but before that, you can't use it because it's not defined yet. That's an important thing to throw out. So let's talk about class level scope now. So we have a private integer, we call it j, and it's now equal to 0. All these lines can use j. However, if I were to make another class, and I made j equal 2, this is going to run an error, because this is a class level variable. Well, it's also going to run an error because it's a declared private access. So you're actually going to get 2 compile errors, because your first compile error is because it's private, so you can't access it outside the class. And second of all, you're gonna get another error that's saying j is not defined, because j isn't defined. J is only defined in class A. It's not defined in class B. So that's why you'll get 2 errors, not just 1. So that's kind of how class level scope works. It's only accessible in the class. So if you try to make j equal 2 in another class or j equals something in another class, you're gonna run an error. Hopefully that makes sense. Now we have a method. Let's say we have a public int add. And I make x equals 6, y equals 5, and then I make y equals 6. What's going to happen there? Well, your compiler is going to throw an error at this line. So let's say this is line 1. Let's say this is line 2. Let's say this is line 3, line 4, line 5, line 6. Your error is going to be thrown at line 6. The compiler is going to throw an error at line 6. And that's because y isn't defined. Y is only defined in this method. So you can only change y in this method. So these will compile, but this will not compile. So your program will terminate. By terminate, I mean it just won't compile. And that's really it. So your parameters are only accessible along the method. That also applies with new variables you declare inside a method. So if I made an integer, whoops, my marker fell, and my handwriting is off. So I made an integer called k, and I made it equal to 2. And I do something like k++, that's gonna also throw an error, because this integer is only accessible in the entire method, because this is called method level scope. Method level scope. It's only accessible in that method it's defined in. So since this method signature is done and then you made an integer k equals 2, you can't modify k outside the method because it's only accessible to that method. And then finally we have block level scope. So if we do like that, this z is only accessible within that block. So I can't modify z in the method, I can't modify z in the class either. I can only modify z inside that block only, and that's what's called block level scope. And that's it. Those are the main 3 types of scopes: class level scope, method level scope, and block level scope. Remember that scope just means the region in which a variable can be accessed. Class level scopes are just variables defined in a class, and they can only be modified within that class. If you try to modify in another class, you're going to get an error thrown. Also, method level scope, your parameters and your integers that you define in a method, or not your integers, but your types, your variables you define in a method, are only accessible in that method. You can't modify them in a class, you can't modify them in another class, you can't modify them in another method. Otherwise, your compiler is going to throw you an error. So method level scope, only accessible, variables only accessible in the method. Block level scope, variables only accessible in the block. So if you access it outside the block, so outside this if statement, outside this, then you're going to get an error thrown. And that's it. That's scope. By the way, there is no coding demonstration for this because it's pretty straightforward. There's not really much to do. So that's kind of the demonstration. And yeah, that's it. I'll see you guys next time.